Hi, I'm Elisabeth Vincentelli. I write for the New York Times and the New Yorker. And today is a very special episode of Marx and Vincentelli because today is the episode you've been waiting for. It's the Vincentelli and Vincentelli episode where I finally succeeded in pushing Peter out and taking the reign of this mad jalopy. And I'm particularly excited because today I'm actually not entirely alone. We have a guest, or I have a guest, and it's Lauren Halvorsen. Am I butchering your name the way I butcher every other name? No.
You did it perfectly.
Thank you. I don't think this is correct, but I will go along with that. And so Lauren is putting together the weekly theater newsletter, Nothing for the Group. It's on Substack, just like this podcast. So you can subscribe just as you're listening to this or right after, do a 2-for-1 thing. It'll be perfect. Lauren is a dramaturg and writer based in Washington, D.C., and she has dramaturged. And by the way, that's the word you used when I asked you in an email. What you did, you say you used dramaturg as a verb, which I find a little jarring. Is that a dramaturg thing, to use it as a verb?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I feel like institutionally we say that all the time.
Okay. You can tell I'm completely not institution-minded I am, because I was like, this is not a verb. Anyway, she's dramaturged over 40 new contemporary and classic plays. And she has held artistic and literary positions at the Alley Theater, City Theater Company, Wardbridge Playwrights Lab, the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center, the Wilma Studio Theater, where she was the Associate Literary Director for 9 years. She's currently working on projects for Theater Washington, Woolly Mammoth, Baltimore Center Stage, Repertory Theater of St. Louis, and Long Wharf, which is pretty much the entire Amtrak Northeast Corridor and some, outliers. You cover
I do
wide.
love the quiet car, so that it feels very on brand for me.
Okay, I really feel that Peter should be here because Peter is notoriously obsessed with the quiet car, and he's the enforcer. No, he's tweeted a lot from the quiet car, so I am also a fan of the quiet car, obviously. So you started Nothing for the Group in July 2020. Clearly a kind of pandemic connection there. We'll get back to that. But the newsletter is really useful for anybody who's interested in theater, especially people who are interested in the more behind-the-scene look at our institutions' work and some of the systemic problems that I think are endemic to the field. So you do season announcements and all that stuff, comings and goings and articles you like. But I think one of the most popular things, and we'll get back to that, is you post new jobs with the salary requirements and you put the living wage in the area where the job is. And those are jarring. It's brought into the open a lot of things that people talk about kind of with their friends or, when they're having coffee, but it's a kind of stuff that is really not to theaters. It's not theater's greatest moment, the way people are paid. So we'll definitely get back to that. But, okay, so can you tell me, was there a moment when you discovered theater and you realized that was going to be your life?
Oh, man.
Was that a light bulb or was that gradual?
It's so strange because I can't remember a time when I wanted to be anything else, that I wanted to work in anything else. I feel like when I grew up in a very small town.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Westport, Connecticut.
Oh, okay.
And the way that I always describe where that is I'm like, oh, it's halfway between Yale and the O'Neill. And then theater people are always like, oh, I know exactly where that is. But I feel like I saw a production of Guys and Dolls when I was in 4th grade, and it was the high school production of at the high school that I ended up going to. And in my mind, that still remains one of the most exhilarating musicals I've ever seen. And I never, there's this part of me that I'm like, would I still feel that way watching it now that I'm 36 years old? And it's probably not, but I love that it is preserved in amber as this very exciting moment where I was just oh, I want to do this forever. I think that there were a couple of key experiences. I did a summer program at Wesleyan when I was in high school that also just solidified that oh, these are my people. And then I think when I transitioned away from performance and I was trying to figure out like what my place was in theater and what my role was going to be, it was really working at the O'Neill. I did 2 summers there and I worked in the literary office there. And not only did I realize that I wanted to be a dramaturg, which I didn't realize before then was an actual career path that somebody could have, but I knew that I wanted to be around playwrights and I wanted to be in a place where new work was happening. I had never had that experience before, and it felt just so energizing. And part of that is also the fact that like the O'Neill is such a special place. And the O'Neill just has this sort of magical energy to it that I wanted to like, I felt like I was chasing that high. Like I wanted to replicate that forever. I always wanted to be surrounded by artists. I always wanted to be working on new work. So I think that those were like the 3 really key things for me.
All right. So explain what a dramaturg does, because I think it's one of the most mysterious jobs in theater.
I know. It definitely took my dad like a good 7 years to have like a solid understanding of what it was. My parents are very proud of me. But, the way that I always talk about it, and part of this is because I live in DC where it's like nothing but journalists in this town. So the way that I find that most people in DC can understand it is I often say that I'm like a collaborative editor and an early audience member. So like, it's like every single creative process that you work on a play is going to be different. And I feel like it's my job as the dramaturg to be responsive to like the rhythms and needs of every artistic team and like not enter with any sort of fixed collaboration or like fixed idea of what our collaboration is going to look like. And I just think that I'm there to like help like guide, like understand what the collective vision for the production is, and then know what our artistic goals are so that like as like the team, as the director and the playwright and the designers and the actors, as we build this world of the play, I think that I'm there so that I can reflect back to them what I'm seeing and how it either adheres or deviates from that understanding of what we're trying to create together. And so that's like in a rehearsal room. I also primarily have been a dramaturg in institutions. So there's also like an institutional aspect of dramaturgy. And with that, I really saw it as like, it's not just like helping plan seasons and reading plays and doing writing, but I felt like it was my job to help shape the overall messaging of narrative of the work that a theater was doing, to like not just help the staff become ambassadors for the work, but also to make sure that everybody knew the story of why we were producing these plays so that they can go out and tell their various constituents about it. So because of that, I always felt like my work was always rooted in this like ideas of like advocacy and service. And I think that I always say that like dramaturgs have a pathological desire to be useful. I think that has been a real guiding principle for me, is like, how can I be helpful? How can I be useful?
So that's interesting, because it sounds like that would put you in contact with a lot of different parts of a theater. Like, for instance, that would put, parts of it would be with maybe more like the artistic director, but then you might also be talking to the marketing team, like in terms of, is that like...
Oh, constantly.
Okay. How's that working out, like coordinating between these people who may not necessarily have the same goals and ideas?
Yeah, I mean, it varies depending. I will say that I've worked at like all different size organizations. And I would say that like larger organizations, for example, when I worked at the Alley Theater, that's a very large staff. So it felt like there was a little bit more siloing that happened, in part because like you had a 10-person marketing department, et cetera. But for more of the mid-size and smaller theaters that I worked at, for example, for the majority of the time that I was at studio, I think we had about 40 people on staff. And it was just interesting when I started at studio because they did not have a culture of dramaturgy beforehand. They had a dramaturg on staff, but they were primarily a staff writer, et cetera. But they didn't have dramaturgs in the room, and they didn't really have a culture of new work or commissioning. And that was one of the things that I was brought on with, along with Adrienne Alice Hansel, to help shape over our time there. And one of the things that I think when people realize that it's like, oh, here are 2 people who really deeply care about this work and can answer questions and help us be better at our jobs. And I felt like I worked so closely with marketing because they need to know, like, who is our audience and how do we talk about this play in a way that feels not only true to what the play is, but also being the dramaturg, you're in the room and you're understanding specifically what the production is. So it's like not only, selling this play as a text, as a story, but also like, what is this specific production and this team of people doing? And I felt like that communication channel was so valuable for people in an institution. And I felt like we worked a lot with development too, to help sort of shape narratives around grants, particularly around new work, but also, as they're building a season and they're thinking about underwriters, we can sort of say like, here are like some key points about how to talk about this play. So then you can go out and find the people who are going to be most excited about it. And I worked really closely with front of house too, because I think that front of house is often sidelined. And I think that front of house is one of the most valuable departments in an organization because they are really like the front lines to your audience. I would say that our box office and front of house spent more time and knows our audience more intimately than I think I do. I always felt like I had a more abstract understanding outside of like, moderating talkbacks. But I felt like it was my job to like really feel like they were equipped to answer any questions or address any issues about the work that came up. And I always tried to make myself a resource to them.
That's a really good point, and I'd never really thought of. I mean, it's clear because they are the only ones that the audience members are in touch with. They're not going to ask her questions to the artistic director or the company manager or the set designer or many of. I mean, the people they see are the people at the box office, the ushers, the house manager. They're usually there. And they often also, they might be jobs where there's like maybe a little higher turnover sometimes.
Yes.
If there's like a busier season, they may get more people in. And you're right. I feel like they're often not trained, which is, of course, not their fault at all. It's like a structural issue of like, yeah, you need to be trained.
And so many, I think it's also true of like the ushers who are volunteers, but like, you will not find anybody more enthusiastic about a theater and their work than like the volunteer usher corps too. So, I don't know. I always thought that was one of the great joys of my job was also working with that and not just feeling like I was siloed to reading plays, but really having like an upstairs, downstairs mentality where I was just working with everybody. And I think that's one of the things that I really enjoyed about my time at studio was how central that literary department felt to like the inner workings of that theater.
So how does that work? But then you also work with the playwrights who may be at various stages of their careers. How's that working out usually? Is that like, do you define the relationship with them? I mean, I'm sure it's like it wildly varies and, like everything else, you have the divas and the ones who are super nice and the rest in between somewhere.
I think so much of the work of an institutional literary manager and dramaturg is that sort of not just building of relationships, but also maintenance of relationships over time. Because, a theater can only program like 7 to 10 plays a year, but that doesn't mean that you don't read writers that you're really excited about, even though you can't work with them right away. So there is a sort of delicate art of how to maintain interest and connections. I found that like maintaining playwright relationships was the way that studio was structured is that like, particularly when I was working on a new work, I would often have a chance to have a workshop or I'd be guiding the playwright through the commissioning process at every single stage with drafts, etc. So we were able to build a relationship over time, which I think is, the way to do it. So it wasn't like we got into rehearsal on the first day and we didn't know each other.
Right.
Although sometimes, especially the way that dramaturgical assignments work within a theater is that, you are often just like assigned to a show. Previously, I was working at a theater where we would, just split the season in half. And so the hard thing was to try to build a relationship with the director ahead of time. And a lot of that happened over email. You usually had maybe one in-person meeting, like you got to see them at the production meeting and have a conversation, etc. But I found that sometimes that was a little bit harder. But I also feel like with directors, it's like you kind of have to wait for them to come to you a little bit as you're like building this relationship and figuring out, what are we going to be to each other? What's your process? I never think, I don't think that not every director likes to work with a dramaturg, which I totally understand. And I would never want to force myself on a process. But being an institutional person, I also felt that there were certain things that were like, let me help you navigate some of like the idiosyncratic nature of like the way that this theater does things, or let me sort of act as a go-between for marketing, for, you know, there were a lot of different ways that I could help the production if like me and the artistic director didn't have an artistic connection. That didn't happen very often. I felt pretty lucky about that. But, you know, it was just like every single time you walked into a room, you didn't know, like the alchemy of like the people in there was going to be different. So I just felt like as a dramaturg, it's like you have this like toolbox of like skills and, you know, emotional intelligence, and you just go in there and you try to like apply it for the situation.
And diplomacy.
Exactly. Diplomacy. I mean, I've often said that I should have majored in peace and conflict studies instead of English, because I think that would have served me better in my theater career. But yeah, I mean, every single time it's different, and that's part of the joy. But I think it also, like, when I was first starting out, I was just like, yes, I finally figured out how to do this. Oh, wait, this process is over and I have to start it all over again. And when I started, that was very stressful. But then as I went on, it was actually one of the things that I loved most about it was how fleeting it felt.
I feel like the dramaturg is also at the center of a debate that has been really going strong for the past several years, which is the debate around the issue of authorship. Mm-hmm. I think there was this big case, and I think that was it Rent, where I think the dramaturg sued?
Yeah, that was Lynn Thompson and Rent. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's always been there, right? It's always been there. So the dramaturg is very intimately linked to the issue of authorship, which of course it's something that we talk a lot these days. And so where do you stand on that? Because clearly, I don't know. I mean, I keep waffling a lot on that issue and as to how it's defined. And sometimes I feel like I have a very kind of like old school view of it as like, there's one person, there's one author, because, you know, you have to draw the line somewhere. And then there are days when I think, well, if they can have like 10 songwriters credits on, you know, R&B songs nowadays, because like one person wrote a hook. Like if you take a song now, you have like 7 co-writers, and like someone may have just come up with like 3 words. It's clearly not the case in theater. But do you feel that like we might even go into this kind of model? Like, is this changing in that direction or not at all?
I think that's interesting, because I think the conversation that I'm more interested in as far as like authorship is, can dramaturgs be generative artists? And I think that there are a lot of examples of like people starting to figure that out. I think one of the ones that I find most interesting is Kat Rodriguez and Ariel Seibert, who are both dramaturgs involved with Fake Friends and their involvement with Circle Jerk, which I think is really fascinating about like, what does that mean for a dramaturg to be a generative artist?
Just to clarify, so Fake Friends, as I think like 4 people credited as like the play is by, and there's 4 people, and their functions I think are slightly different on the show, but the show is credited to 4 of them if we go by you know, those 4 people. Okay, and that play was a finalist for the Pulitzer too.
Yes,
in its virtual version.
Yeah. And also here in DC, we have a local playwrights collective called The Welders. And in their second class, one of their writers was a dramaturg, Hannah Hessel-Ratner, who developed a piece that also felt, when I saw it, I was just like, oh yeah, this is the type of work that a dramaturg would do. Because it just felt like it like appealed to like her sense of like audience engagement, but also storytelling, but also like, it just felt like, I was just like, oh, I see this dramaturgical brain all over that. So I am very interested in what that looks like. In terms of authorship, I just, you know, I mean, I think that has to be like an evolving and ongoing conversation. I think a lot of things have changed since Rent. But I do think that there is, I mean, I don't know. I've never been in a situation where I felt like my role as a dramaturg crossed over into authorship, where I felt like I wanted that sort of credit. But I think that that just needs to be a conversation that needs to be evolving, especially if the nature of the collaboration is changing.
So I guess in terms of comparison, it would be closer, theater would be closer to the literary model where the editor does not get credit on the cover, as opposed to a pop music model where you have like several songwriters credited. And that also has to do with, I think, the system of payment and royalties and all that, which each industry has a, different system. But it sounds like what you're saying is that theater is closer to, oh my God, payments. Let's not even get into that.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I think, dramaturgs, like, you're lucky sometimes to even get credited. I mean, there are a lot of theaters where you have a staff dramaturg who won't even get a production credit on it, and they'll work on it. So I think that, it's an ongoing, I mean, the sort of battle of like a dramaturg's value to a production, I think is also something that is evolving, especially because dramaturgs don't have any sort of contractual protections. We don't have a union. We don't have, theaters don't necessarily see our position on a creative team as necessary and as vital. So I think that there are like bigger sort of like large scale issues about advocacy, about what dramaturgs can add to a production that need to happen in terms of like asserting our value and asserting our worth. And I think that there's some good work that LMDA is doing around that, around like having standard contracts and having sort of guides for like how to navigate freelance payments. But I think there just needs, it just, it's like, if sometimes it feels like you're starting from square one about who are you? Why do you need to be here? Why are we paying you? That there just needs to be like still this wider scale education about what exactly we do and why it's important.
Well, actually, you know what, to circle back to the issue of payments, like for instance, another show that was involved in issues of authorship was Hamilton, because of what some cast members did very early on in the process. Now, they're not credited as having created Hamilton, but my understanding is that some of them are getting like a tiny little, they're getting a little bit of extra money. And do you think there might be a model similar like that for dramaturg, where you may not get a authorship credit, but you may get like half a point or something? I mean, that seems like a little bit more. Of course, she's smiling like, yes.
I would love that. Who wouldn't love that? But I mean,
that seems like, but then at the same time, like, where do you stop? But yeah.
Well, it's like I'm also smiling just because I've been involved in those commissioning contracts and I know how hard it is to get any sort of participation.
Yeah.
And that's just even when you are, an actual institution that is, supporting the development of the work.
Right.
So, I mean, I would love that. And I think, again, it just sort of, it's so hard to like set up parameters for that too, just because, every collaboration, like I said, is different. But I would love that. All the give dramaturgs all the participation points, It kept the lights on at the, like Chorus Line kept the lights on at the Public for 25 years. We can get a little, you could throw us a little something.
Yes. Okay. So you were on staff for many years, and now you're a freelancer, right?
Yeah, I was laid off in June 2020, so not that far into the pandemic.
From where?
I was laid off from studio theater.
Okay. And so you decide, you kind of pushed into the freelance life, which I'm very familiar with. And what else? What is it like to be a freelance dramaturg? Like, how does it work?
Well, So when I lost my job, I knew that my job search was going to take me outside of theater, just because it was, a horrible time, and you knew that like the industry was not coming back for a while. Right. And I, unfortunately, am not one of those people with a trust fund, so I needed. I wish I had one. I'd be great at it, but I knew that I needed to find employment, and I knew that I needed to find health insurance. So I got a day job outside of the industry, working at an engineering company, which is great and gives me stability and is very flexible and gives me a 9 to 5. And then as I started, right now I would say that there's like a couple of buckets to my freelance life. And some of it, so part of it is the newsletter, which has actually like turned into basically a part-time job in terms of writing and curating and just like dealing with a lot of the business around it and the correspondence around it, which I love. And then I also do some like various like content strategy projects for Theater Washington. And then I'm currently working with the 4 theaters we mentioned, Woolly Mammoth, Center Stage, Long Wharf, and Repertory Theater of St. Louis, to help document their Artistic Caucus project. So the Artistic Caucus is these 4 theaters are trying to sort of like disrupt normal artistic development models, and they want to meaningfully integrate independent artists into the fabric of an institution. So they have these 4 independent artists from across the country who are scouting projects, and, they meet quarterly and monthly to share, artists that the theaters might be involved in, like things that they've seen, and they're paid on a monthly retainer. And they brought me on to help document this project, this pilot project, and then hopefully to share out with the field at the end of it, like what the results and what we learned from it and how other theaters can perhaps replicate this model. And when they reached out to me to offer me this, I was just really thrilled because it felt like very up my alley, because I'm so interested in how institutions work. And I am also very sympathetic. I mean, even though I am very critical of institutions, I'm also very sympathetic about how hard it is to get things done in them, particularly when you're at the mid-level, particularly in a time like this when everybody's in, financial free fall. To do something like this that felt really radical, I wanted to be a part of it. And also I admire all four of the artistic directors and all of the work that's happening. So that's part of it. The one thing that's really hard about being a freelance dramaturg right now is that I haven't been able to take on any production dramaturgy gigs, in part because the pay is not enough.
Can you give me an idea what the pay is?
Sure.
I have no idea.
Totally fine. I got offered a 29-hour new play workshop at a Lort theater. And also, when I say 29 hours, I think that my contribution, because I'd be working with a playwright and a director, and there's like the prep you have to do before and all the meetings, like this was going to be a minimum like 40 hours of my time.
Yes.
And they offered me a flat fee of $250.
Oh my God.
And I said no. Yeah. And I said no. And I just, it's just like I would have had to take a week off of work, and I'm like, I would have been losing money. And also I've been doing this for 15 years and it's just depressing. And it's not like, and it's just like, that's how it is everywhere. Or people expect you, the number of people who still come to me and ask me to work for free, I find alarming, especially because I have a newsletter where I write about living wages. And I'm always like, sir, okay, that's a choice. So I find it very depressing that like there isn't, because I miss being in a rehearsal room and I miss being with artists, but I also can't do that anymore. I'm not in a position where I feel like I can take on work like that. I don't feel like it's good for me financially, but I also don't feel like it's good for me emotionally or artistically. So I'm hopeful that one day my schedule and, will allow me to work on something I care about that will also compensate me properly for my time. But I feel like maybe only one of those things will happen. It sort of feels like a tall order to ask for like all the stars to align in that way.
Actually, can you tell me briefly so you get laid off in June 2020 and you start the newsletter like the following month, I think it's July 2020. Right.
Yeah.
So
I did.
Okay, so at night it's grown, as you said. Just what kind of made you want to start it? And it's also very practical. It's very neat. There's not very much editorial in it. It's just like for the most part, it's a series of links. But of course, we can, links are of course curated and selected, so we can see where you stand and what you're trying to communicate through what you put in there. So how did you decide on the format and why did you want to do that?
Yeah. So after I got laid off, I had already been starting to mourn some of the parts of my job that I loved. And one of the things that I did was when I was at studio, I curated this weekly email of reviews and season announcements and stories about artists and projects that we were tracking. And it was one of my favorite things to do. And even though I didn't have a full-time job anymore, it's like, for the past 15 years, I wake up and I check Playbill and I read American theater and I read the New York Times, and I wasn't going to stop doing that. And because I knew that I was going to have to find a job outside of theater, this also felt like a way for me to not only stay tethered to it, but to figure out what my own writing in my own voice sounded like after writing in institutional voice for 9 years. And I wanted to do something that, also was writing that wasn't writing cover letters for jobs that I didn't want. So it felt like it was a bit of a creative project in kind of a desperate time. And I really didn't think that anybody, I was actually just looking today that it's like, I think when I sent the first one out, I had maybe 300 subscribers, and now I have 4,200. I've tried to maintain that. It's become kind of a joke, but I always say that I'm not a journalist because I'm not objective and I think I'm incredibly biased. And I state that up front. And but I do try to be very mindful about the type of work that I highlight and feature. It's like, I don't want it to just be New York centric or just about Lord theaters. I'm very interested in projects that are like happening outside of that machinery while also sort of tracking trends that are happening regionally overall. But I also say that I don't think it's like a comprehensive listing service either. It's like I'm trying to find things that I think are like interesting and relevant and like vital to the field. For the first year, theaters weren't really producing anything. So it was a lot more stories about various changes that were happening that I would just sort of like recap a lot of these sort of reckonings and events that were going on. And now I feel like there's so much interesting stuff happening that I would rather talk about that. But I think that I always try to be very mindful about how I recap events because I never want my recap or my summary of something to substitute somebody reading the full text, but rather to like pique their interest enough to like redirect them to the original source, particularly when I'm linking to other journalists, et cetera. And I always, try to do that because I'm not doing any original reporting myself at the time. I'm doing a lot of like aggregating. So I don't ever want that to substitute like reading somebody's actual work. So that has become kind of like a fun creative writing exercise for me to be like, what can I say that's going to make somebody click on this article? I think one of the things that's so interesting is that I'm finding is like when you work in theater full time, it's like you are working 60 to 80 hour weeks sometimes, but it's like spread over 7 days. So it just like permeates your whole existence. And I'm finding it very challenging to work in these very compressed blocks of time. And then it's just like, yeah, I'm working 40 hours, but it's just like you have to be very focused and in the zone for like 8 to 5. And then you have all this free time. And it's just like after being it, like, you think that that's actually sounds like preferable, but after doing the former for, my entire life, it's been such a weird adjustment to then figure out, well, how do I work in my creative work when my creative work isn't my primary work? And I think that's been a lot of like what the last 2 years has been is also like figuring out exactly what my process is and where this fits in as it's grown in both, size and scope and what I want to do.
Do you get a sense like what do people write to you about? Like, do you get like into dialogues with your readers? I mean, do you get a sense of like what is on people's minds when it comes to theater?
Yeah. I get so many emails from early career people who are so discouraged or who also want to talk about how do I move on from this incredibly damaging and horrible, usually apprenticeship, internship, or fellowship in which I was exploited or unpaid? I would say that is like the majority of the emails that I get. And also just like sort of general, like, how do I have a theater career at this time when it feels so impossible to have one? I mean, I often say that I have like a very depressing inbox, but I also think that I like, part of being a dramaturg is that you have that camaraderie. And I also think that it's important to showcase those stories because I think that it also acts as a counter narrative to this idea that it's like, theater's back, baby. It's like, well, like it's back, but like there's still a lot of problems. And you've also left a lot of people behind while making a lot of promises about the type of organizations that you want to be. And I'm seeing a real distance between like words and action. And, it's just like, I mean, I just don't think that you can have this sort of like shellacked narrative that like everything is great now because there are still like, people on the margins. Theater has always been an industry that has run on the youthful enthusiasm and work ethic of young people. And there are still plenty of organizations out there that are doing that have learned absolutely nothing. And so I think that that's also become a little bit of my beat in terms of the, that's not a living wage. I think that I get more submissions and more comments about that than anything else. And that was as soon as I started doing that last July. And at the time I didn't include, I only included the salary description and I included the living wage estimate. And since then I've also started including 990 data.
I'm going to interject a second. Okay, so for listeners who are blissfully not versed into tax stuff, the 990 is the tax form that nonprofits file, and they're public. So you can go. I like GuideStar. You can go to GuideStar and look up the Public Theater or Signature or the Alley, whichever theater company, Lincoln Center Theater, just talk about the New York ones, but pretty much any nonprofit theater company, it'll be there. And you will see a lot of very interesting things, including the salaries of the leadership. And let me tell you, friends, it's an eye-opening endeavor, and it'll make you so furious. I know it does me. It just makes me so furious. Because one of the things is like it's the living, salary in a city, but it's also, as you were mentioning, the range within the lower salaries and the higher ones in an institution. And it's the multiple, I guess, of the basic salary that an artistic director or leadership makes that I think is really getting to people now. Like it's that discrepancy.
Well, yeah, and it's that discrepancy. And I also think that the other thing that I've started pointing out, I do this more on Twitter, but you have these job postings that also have very prominent anti-racism statements and land acknowledgements, and then have these salaries that are below a living wage. And I'm just and I always read this, I'm like, there's a real disconnect here between DEI work in theory and DEI work in practice, because paying people below a living wage is not anti-racist. It's the complete opposite of that. And when I see, and it's just another example of the way that theaters talk about themselves rather than what transparently they are offering people. And I think the other challenge of seeing a lot of these below living wage salaries is if you are interested in creating a diverse, inclusive workplace, when you post a salary below the living wage, you are basically reducing the number of applicants that can afford to apply for that, because positions like that are not conducive to people who are caretakers for people that have student loan debt, which is most of this country, as well as people who have families, who are parents, who are, anything. I mean, even, I have always been a single person with no debt, and I found it very hard to live. I was making when I left studio, I was making $50,000 a year in DC, and that felt okay. But for most of my time there, I was making somewhere between 40 and 45. And that was a struggle, even though I had excellent health benefits and I lived within walking distance. And, there were all of these other perks to the job that I had. It was difficult. And when I was considering which living wage calculator to use, because there are a couple, I used the one that I felt best reflected my own experience as somebody who worked in this industry and had to make it work for myself. And I think that since I've left, and now that I'm making significantly more money, it's just amazing how much that changes your quality of life when you're not thinking about every single dollar and where it's going. And, you can actually save money, which is something I never was able to do. And when we talk about these conversations that I don't think that we were having during the pandemic was, these artistic directors with these massive salaries were making a big show of saying that they were taking a 10 to 20% pay cut. But that means nothing when you make $400,000 a year and you have a staff carpenter who's making $40K a year, and you lay them off and they've never made enough money to really build the kind of savings and capital that they need in order to survive a long layoff, where it's you're just taking off 10 to 20%, you'll be fine. You also have the kind of wealth to survive that sort of that period of not being paid as much. And that was one of the things that was very frustrating to me, because it felt like for so many theater workers at the beginning of the pandemic, it was you had a choice. You were either got laid off, you got long-term furloughed for God knows how long, or you had to take some astronomical pay cut that made your quality of life impossible. And I felt that I was very lucky that I got laid off because I could just move on. In some ways, that felt like one of the kindest things that could have happened to me at the time, because I think if I had to exist in that sort of financially precarious limbo, I don't think that I emotionally would have been able to handle that. And there are people who did that for the entirety of the time and were still expected to work at, the same level that they were previously when theaters were operating on skeleton crews. And then, they produce back and it's back to business. And I think this is something I write about a lot, is just you can't really measure the losses of what this industry has gone through over the last 2 years, because so much of it just can't be calculated. Some of it can, but a lot of it can't. And everybody I know is completely burned out.
Right.
Just absolutely. And I think that's also a lot of the emails that I get is everybody, it's like even the people that are still working in theater are just totally exhausted. Like there is a lot of hope, there is a lot of joy, but there is a lot of exhaustion. And I think that all of that needs to coexist and live alongside each other if we're actually going to move on and try to make this a sustainable industry instead of trying to forget about it just because like we can sell subscriptions again, you know?
Well, okay. So just to play devil's advocate for a second, like a lot of the arguments we hear are like, well, we're a small company, we can't afford to pay more than X thousands of dollars for this job, and our artistic director is not making that much, and in many cases, they don't make that much. So the economics of it they're terrible. It's true. I mean, there are major institutions that do have the cash and they're sitting on they're okay, but then there's like a lot of the tiny ones. Like, what do? They can't. They're in good faith. They can't. They mean that the anti-racist statement and diversity, but they also kind of like. So what happens there?
Yeah, I know. And like, that's one of the things that's so challenging at a time when like all of these conversations were happening. It just also is also happening at a time when theaters have never been more cash poor.
Right.
And, I think that overall, it's just like, I really think that theaters need to take a cold, hard look at their ambition and their scope of the work that they do. And it's like, is it worth it to produce so many shows if you cannot give your staff and the people making that work, if you cannot pay them like the basic minimum to have like, a comfortable life, which is their right? Like, should you be producing as many plays, or should you scale back in order to more responsibly compensate the people that are doing the work for you? And, I think that looks different for every single theater. What does ethical producing look like?
It sounds like that's the option that I am absolutely not privy to anything that happened behind the scenes, but it seems that it's the option that the Williamstown Theatre Festival took. They have a much smaller footprint this summer. They ran into a lot of issues last summer for various reasons. And this summer, the Williamstown Festival is much smaller. And it seems to be kind of like what you're saying. They really reduced. But so it means that you have less people making more money as opposed to more people making less money. That seems to be very, very roughly the solution that they went for.
Yeah, exactly. And I also think the end of the Humana Festival at Actors Theatre of Louisville, it's just like, it's so vital and so important to have like a large scale new play festival like that outside of the major theater markets and to really be a launching pad. But is it worth it when you are relying on an underpaid apprentice company essentially to make that festival run? And also that it like completely drains institutional capacity for the rest of your staff. And the fact that they made the decision to be like, you know what? No, I mean, there were also like a lot of other financial foundation issues in terms of funding there. But I think that there was also a real question about institutional capacity and priorities in terms of keeping the decision to keep that festival going. And I think that and Williamstown are two really good examples of like theaters having that sort of like really hard conversation with themselves about what does the future look like for them in the wake of like some really like deep financial, and also in the case of Williamstown, like real reckonings about their labor practices, especially their early career programs.
Well, Williamstown, I mean, I've seen, you just look around and you see like recommendations. Oh my God, they're barely doing anything this summer. What happened to that festival? They used to have tons of shows, and this summer there's like 3 or 4, I can't remember. So there's but then it's like, okay, well, how are they going to pay for it? Do you really want them to hike their ticket prices or not pay people? Like, I mean, I don't see any good solution.
Yeah, it's really, no matter what you're doing, there's going to be some sort of sacrifice or some kind of compromise. But it's also my hope that, and I don't think that this happens now, but it's like, I really wish that there was also a way for theater audiences to also think about yes, like this, you're seeing plays for entertainment, but you should also care about the conditions in which art is made. And that sort of like ethical responsibility, I think that theater audiences also have that. Like, I mean, we talk about ethical consumership all the time. And I think that should also apply to the theater that you consume as well. It's not just about not buying books at Amazon, it also extends to like, do you want to see a play knowing that the crew that has been working like illegal overnight shifts and it's like, a bunch of unpaid interns essentially keeping it afloat? I don't, I don't want to see that. And I don't think that any art is worth that. And I think that so much of, it's just interesting. When I previously worked at the Alley Theater, which now its issues were very well known with its previous artistic director. And, at the time, I think that there is this idea that like, well, art is worth it. Art is worth any sort of like toxicity or tyrannical behavior. And I just don't buy that anymore. I really don't. I think that, I just find that so much of that thinking, that like myth of the artistic genius, is kept in place to like preserve this status quo. And all I want in theater is for people to be paid what they're worth and for theaters to respect their workers' lives inside and outside of work. And I do not think that it is that hard of a shift, but I think that it requires a real reckoning with leadership and with their power and how they hold their power and how they distribute power. And people do not want to do it. But that, I think, is the only way that this industry is going to continue in any sort of healthy and sustainable way. I mean, anecdotally, I'm already hearing from so many theater companies, not just on the East Coast, but around the country, that they are having a horrible time hiring. It is so difficult to find people based on the wages that they're providing, particularly in the production department, which is historically like one of the most underpaid departments and undervalued in terms of the expertise and the labor and the like skill that they provide a theater. And theaters are finding it, they can't keep people on staff, because I also think that there's just like a real reckoning in terms of workers that are happening, that is just like, well, why am I going to do this? Why am I going to kill myself for this job that like ultimately it doesn't feel invested in me as a person, and doesn't pay me a living wage? Like, why don't I just go do something else?
So you're not believing in like sacrificing yourself for the cause of theater?
I mean, maybe when I was 22, but not anymore. No, I don't think that anybody should do that at all.
I can't decide if this conversation has made me like incredibly depressed or incredibly optimistic.
I find that that's what people often say to me.
Like, it's like just two extremes that are just, either incredibly depressing or incredibly exciting.
The thing that I will say, and the thing that I do find very encouraging, is that I think that this current wave of leadership transitions, which I sort of refer to as the regional theater Game of Thrones in the newsletter, but I am very encouraged by so many of these leadership transitions and people coming in. But the only thing that I want is for them to be given the resources and agency to do the transformational change that they want to do. And that is really, it's that I have that hope, but I also have that pragmatism at the same time. That it's like, in order for that to happen, I know that there are so many institutional building blocks that need to go into supporting that person in order to achieve the things that they want to do. And a lot of that has to do with boards and board support. And a lot of that has to do like with actually having like money and support of artistic vision, et cetera. And I'm like so curious to see, like, we had this huge sea change of leadership and then we had this pandemic, that like, what does it look like for people to start programming the seasons that they want? And especially with like in this new era, I don't know. That is something like, so this isn't a completely depressing conversation. That is something that gives me a lot of hope. And I also think that there are, I mean, I post like jobs that aren't like posting a living wage a lot, but I also think that there are some programs that are starting to like really examine, particularly early career, like the ways in which those programs are not healthy or sustainable. And I think that there are, it's like, how can we provide a fellowship and like a sort of like actual educational experience while also like trying to pay these like fresh out of college students, like what they deserve. And I think that there are some organizations that are doing it. There are a lot that aren't, but it's also like, it's not going to be a one fell swoop kind of thing. It's just, there's so many problems and there's so many ways to address them. And I think it's just like, you just got to go one by one. And it's going to take just a really long time. But I think that there are so many people that care. And there are so many people that are trying to do it. So that does give me hope.
Okay. I think we're going to stop here because it's an upbeat moment. We don't want to leave the listeners, funk. This is like, I'm going to stop right there. We have to stop. You just do not open your mouth anymore. You're done. This is perfect. No, I'm kidding. Well, oh my God, Lauren, thank you so much. We could go on, and I actually still have some questions, but we're going to have to do like a part 2 at some point or something, because like I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of some of the weeds that we could discuss here, but that'll be for another time.
Of course.
Thank you so much again. And please, everybody, subscribe to Nothing for the Group. Oh my God. Okay. So that was really bracing. A full hour of theater excitement, courtesy of moi, Elisabeth Vincentelli. I write for the New York Times and the New Yorker. And I think Peter may actually be back for the next episode. I don't think I managed to like kick him out permanently of the podcast that bears his name, but I am here at home, stroking a fluffy white cat, preparing world domination, one podcast at a time. Until then, see you on the aisle.